Okay, I want to make one thing clear. For society to work and not devolve into chaos, people have to obey the laws. So when I criticize the drone regulations in this video, or say some of the current rules are dumb, that doesn't mean you should stop obeying them. If you do, you're breaking the law. Instead, follow the rules to the best of your ability and work to change and improve them. Hi, I'm Don from dondroneson. Yeah, it's been 2 years since the current Canadian drone regulations were introduced, so they're due for an overhaul. Let's roll up our sleeves and assess their effectiveness on a scale of good to dumb. And I have some very strong recommendations towards the end of this video. The regulations, introduced in 2019, break down into 5 main areas and a total of 81 individual rules. The first 4 areas are mainly administrative in nature: drone registration, basic and advanced pilot certification, flight reviewer certification, stuff for drone manufacturers, and the operations that require an SFOC. I'll spin through this stuff first and fairly quickly, so we can spend more time on the operating and flight rules, of which there are 46 individual regulations. I've grouped these ones into 5 sub-areas I call basic safety, pre-flight checks, procedures, where you can fly, and special cases. These aren't official groupings, but they work to bring rules together in logical bunches. And by the way, criticism number 1, way too many rules. Anyways, in evaluating these rules, I've used a similar scale to what I used for the exam knowledge area evaluation. Don's magic scale of sanity. Good means the rule makes sense and focuses on the right stuff. Okay means it's all right, but has some room for improvement. And I'll spell those improvement areas out. No need means the rule should be eliminated, either because it's covered adequately by other rules or is overly prescriptive. By overly prescriptive, I mean it dives too deeply into exactly how we need to do something. A lot of these rules could simply be guidelines. And finally, dumb. These rules are absolute nonsense. Now, there are only a few of these, but they really should be eliminated. So, I didn't just arbitrarily cast judgment on the rules one by one. Instead, I came up with some principles first of what the regulations should focus on. I feel that drone registration and pilot certification are good things to have, but the operating rules should focus only on safety and where you can fly and cannot fly. And the regulations should not be attempting to equate drones with manned aircraft and their regulations. And drone pilots should not be required to operate like manned aircraft pilots. And I see this in far too many of the rules. Finally, we should not have best practices and guidelines built into the regulations. Just because using a checklist is a really good idea does not mean that someone should be considered to be breaking the law if they don't use one. Okay, with these principles in mind and my magic scale of sanity at the ready, let's dive into this. Drone registration is easy. I'm all for it and gave the whole section an okay rating. But only okay because it should be possible and fairly easy for foreign drone owners to register their drones in Canada. Next, pilot and flight reviewer certification. There are 20 rules covering these areas, and I'm not going to dive into each one. You already know what I think about the exams, so let's just put that aside for now. For these areas, the certifications, I give them all, again, an okay rating, with 2 areas for improvement. First, again, it should be possible for foreign pilots to certify, at least for the basic, without going through the SFOC process. That's ridiculous. And secondly, the advanced level certification should require, in addition to an exam and a flight review, a certain number of flight hours. Now, given that advanced pilots are permitted to fly in controlled airspace, I think actual stick time is important before getting anywhere near aircraft or close to people, for that matter. How much flight time? Well, I'm not sure. I'd like to hear your input on that. The next area is the manufacturer's requirements for declaring drone models fit for advanced operations. To me, well, these seemed pretty good, so I simply declared good on my magic scale. There are 3 rules dedicated to Special Flight Operations Certificates, or SFOCs. In general, I think these are okay, but as we've discussed in yet another video, Transport Canada is proposing changes in this area, including charging fees for processing SFOCs. 2 improvement areas. Simply reduce or eliminate cases where an SFOC is currently required, like flying in controlled airspace around DND airports. Come on, Nav Canada should be able to front this kind of request like any other controlled airspace, coordinating with DND themselves. Also, these proposed SFOC fees need serious reconsideration and adjustment. Check out my video on that for details. Okay, onwards and upwards, as we droners like to say, and into the general operating and flight rules sections, one sub-area at a time. But here's a sneak preview of how I've scored them. And you can see there's a lot of red. Now, fortunately, the first sub-area, which is basic safety, looks pretty green. Let's look at the exceptions. 901.19 talks about the fitness of crew members, and in my mind, is totally dumb. This is a classic case of copy and pasting from manned aircraft rules. No alcohol consumption within 12 hours of flying, and no cannabis use within 28 days. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not encouraging drunk or stoned flying, but making a drone rule that is so much more strict than driving a car makes absolutely no sense and just leads people to, well, throw out all the rules just because of this one. So just align with sensible and realistic automotive-based restrictions, and I don't think we'll see any complaints. I want to focus on 2 of the rules I declared merely okay. 901.11 is the visual line of sight to your drone rule. In my opinion, this should be replaced with a visual line of sight to the area of operation only. You should not need to see your actual drone, just the piece of sky it's flying in. This is more practical and what many of us already do and do safely. This should apply to both basic and advanced pilots and will fit in nicely with a recommendation I'll share with you a little later on. The other one to discuss is 901.32, called Control of RPAS, saying you must be able to take immediate control of your drone at all times. This basically renders many autonomous flight modes, even like selfies and follow me, certainly, that kind of stuff is absolutely illegal, regardless of the environment you're using them in. This should be changed to allow these functions to be applied when they're used safely. Don't use them in controlled airspace or near crowds of people, for example, but in an open field, fill your boots. Let's move on to the next sub-area, pre-flight checks. These 7 rules cover a myriad of sensible ideas, unfortunately cast as legal obligations. Doing site survey checks. Hey, did I just hear somebody mutter the air, ground, weather, people song? Well, good for you. This is the kind of simple mental check that covers most of these rules. I think the rules themselves are far too prescriptive and would be better positioned as guidelines and recommendations rather than regulations. Do we really need a rule, a legal statement that says we should check our battery level before flying, or only fly within the manufacturer's recommended temperature range? Come on, we're expected to drive a car at a speed suitable for the weather conditions. Shouldn't the same kind of principle apply to drone rules? And we're in Canada. Every once in a while, it's actually above 0. The rest of the time, we need to adjust our flight times downwards and keep a close eye on the battery levels. Can't we as responsible drone pilots be permitted to make sensible judgment calls on issues like this? Anyways, you will see later on that I propose a new rule called situational awareness that simplifies a lot of this stuff down to ensure your drone is in good condition and your flight area is safe and legal. Next sub-area, procedures. These rules require us to have procedures and checklists for normal and emergency situations. We have to carry our instruction manual around with us, keep flight logs and maintenance records. It was all this nonsense that inspired me to create Drone Pilot Canada to begin with. There was no way I was going to lug around a binder with all this crap, and I hope you didn't think you would be too. To me, this is just a ridiculous attempt to make drone pilots follow manned aircraft rules. Now, there's no doubt these are best practices and terrific recommendations, but absolutely dumb as legal requirements. Let's move on to the where you can fly sub-area. And let's start with the dumb one, advertised events. This rule requires drone pilots to secure an SFOC to fly within 30 meters of any publicly advertised event, such as a concert or sporting event. This seems like overkill, particularly since we're already restricted in terms of proximity to people, 30 meters for basic operations, and 5 meters if you have your advanced. Aren't these sufficient? And if an event organizer really wants to restrict the airspace for whatever reason, even if it's for copyright protection in the case of some outdoor sporting events, they should be allowed to request a NOTAM-based flight restriction for the duration of the event. Of course, that would require NAV Canada, as keeper of the NOTAMs, to actually make it straightforward to raise such a restriction. Yeah, that might be asking too much. Speaking of proximity to people, I think the current limitation of 30 meters for basic pilots is needlessly restrictive. I think 15 meters is a more reasonable keep-back distance from bystanders. There's no particular science here, just my opinion. What do you think? Then there are the various rules around operating in the vicinity of aerodromes, airports, and heliports. I don't really mind these rules, which is why I rated them okay, but surely this stuff can be simplified. After all aerodromes that are inside controlled airspace are already covered by the controlled airspace rules and procedures, and aerodromes that are outside of controlled airspace are the smaller airports, airfields, and heliports. If there's a plane in the air, the risk is the same, regardless of the class of the airport, certified or registered. So why this extra complication? This can be simplified. And by the way, if NAV Canada stopped hoarding their airport data and made it public, then the DJI FlySafe geozones could be properly aligned. Everyone would be happier with that, and a lot safer. Oh, and one last comment, 901.25, the maximum altitude rule. For some reason I labeled it as good, which it is, but can someone please reword this so it is actually comprehensible? The inside-out logic of the regulations wording, it's actually shocking and certainly baffling to newbie drone pilots. Let's talk about special cases. Now, this is a mixed bag of weird rules, some good, some not. And there are 5 rules I flagged as no need. Carrying living creatures, formation flight, handover restrictions, flight termination systems, and the weirdest, the transponder rule. These just seem like extra baggage, covered by other rules, regulations, procedures, or basic laws, like cruelty to animals. Let's clean house and get rid of these. It's just clutter. Then there's the famous FPV rule, 901.38. This rule states that you must have a visual observer if you are flying a drone and wearing FPV goggles. Now, this same rule is present in virtually every country in the world, and I get the reason. If you're wearing goggles, you can't see what's going on around you, and especially you can't see a manned aircraft that might be approaching outside of your camera's line of sight. The problem is that it doesn't reflect the reality. that most FPV flyers fly at low altitudes, around trees and buildings, and in racing environments. You should not need a visual observer in situations like that. And yet, there are no provisions or exceptions. That's dumb. All right, I'm not going to go into detail for every rule I think is lousy or could be improved, or we'd be here into next week. So feel free to go back and review the other comments that I've made on these slides. Before I finish though, let's have a look at the numbers and my key recommendations out of all of this analysis. From my review of the rules, 64% of them are pretty good, with minor improvements possible. The remaining 36% need some serious revision in order to have a solid set of drone regulations that most people could actually buy into. I recommend first that they eliminate regulations that should be exclusively for manned aircraft. The alcohol and cannabis timelines are the best example. Just align these with driving regulations. Second, eliminate regulations that can be downgraded to simply useful guidelines, things like the use of checklists and procedures. These are good things, like I've said, but should not be laws. Again, is there a legal requirement for running through checklists before driving your car or truck? No. 3, eliminate the advertised event rule. This would be better served by NOTAM-based temporary flight restrictions. Finally, introduce a situational awareness rule to replace a myriad of overly restrictive rules like those related to FPV devices, visual line of sight, site surveys, weather conditions, all that stuff. Now, so let's look at how such a rule could be formulated. The pilot must have full situational awareness by taking appropriate measures to both prepare for and execute a safe flight. The pilot must first have sufficient knowledge of the airspace and physical environment for a safe flight. He or she doesn't need to read VFR charts. Just understand the airspace, any restrictions, and obstacles or bystanders to avoid. Second, the pilot must take into account weather conditions in the area. If it's really cold, take appropriate precautions and wear a hat. Third, ensure the drone is in safe operating condition. Simple. 4, maintain a clear line of sight to the area of operation. Again, this means being able to clearly see where the drone is operating and not necessarily being required to see the drone itself. Seeing the area of operation is sufficient to enable the pilot to take the correct action if a manned aircraft approaches. And finally, the pilot must be prepared for abnormal and emergency situations. I think this combination of simple rules does a much better job at driving home safety than dozens of overly strict regulations that are largely based on manned aircraft operations. Well, there you have it, my assessment of the Canadian RPAS regulations as defined in 2019, and specific recommendations that, in my opinion, would greatly improve them. I'd love to hear your feedback on this stuff, but more importantly, if you wish to provide Transport Canada with your opinion, I've put the email address of the head of the RPAS task force in the description below the video. These guys are looking for feedback and may appreciate your perspective. Thanks for watching. Safe and happy flying.